A romantic rendezvous on Valentine's Day should spark life, but for Richard Schoeck, in 2010, Belton Bridge Park became the perfect place for a betrayal and a violent death. The initial chaos pointed to a random crime, yet the truth of Richard's final moments involves a shocking web of greed, manipulation, and murder for hire, forcing us to go behind the headlines. On Valentine's Day 2010, 46-year-old Richard Schoeck headed to Lula, Georgia, driving toward Belton Bridge Park. His wife, Stacy, had called him there. The invitation itself was vintage romance, a private meeting in a secluded spot to exchange Valentine's gifts before a weekend getaway. It was the kind of plan that keeps a spark alive, a sweet, unexpected detour that belonged only to them. Richard and Stacy had a history of these small, quirky adventures. Little acts of spontaneity meant to keep the flavor in their life. So for Richard, this invitation likely didn't feel like a threat. It felt like another one of those strange connected moments that couples share when they're trying to feel young again. Lula itself was a tiny North Georgia town, home to only about 3,000 people. It was rural, quiet, and easily missed. It was the last place you would expect to find a massive crime scene. But the promised meeting place, Belton Bridge Park, was not the kind of park you likely pictured. There were no charming picnic tables, no playground, and not a single bench to place a read on. It was nothing more than a parking lot with a boat ramp sitting by the Chattahoochee River. The only thing that qualified it as a park was its name and a sign posting its hours, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. After the sun went down, there were no lights, and the whole place became dark, isolated, and a perfect spot to disappear a body. And I know what you're probably thinking, that sounds presumptuous, but it's not, because Belton Bridge Park had already had a reputation. It was a known hotspot for crime, and police were more than familiar with the area. People went there to drink, to party, to do drugs, to go mudding, and multiple bodies had been dumped there before. Officers did their best to patrol, but the area was often flooded, making their job nearly impossible. Even with their history of unruly teenagers and late-night rowdy behavior, police at this point were not necessarily prepared for a murder investigation in 2010. That's because the last murder there had been 6 years earlier in 2004. By the time Richard Schoeck arrived on Valentine's night, he was about to become the 5th person murdered in that parking lot posing as a park. Stacy Schoeck called 911 around 9 p.m., reporting that she had found her husband dead. Richard had been shot to death, his body lying next to his truck, with blood smeared both inside and outside the vehicle. The scattering of the blood suggested a desperate, dynamic scene, not a quick and clean ambush. It looked as if Richard had been trying to run away from the truck while the shots were still ringing out, or maybe desperately trying to climb back inside. Either way, the implication was the same chilling truth. Richard knew something was terribly wrong. He had a brief, painful window of time to react, to move, and to try to survive. Unfortunately, he was not successful. Initially, Stacy was not a suspect. To the investigating officers, Richard's murder looked completely random, like a crime of opportunity. However, there was no robbery, which made the scene confusing, but still wasn't sending alarm signals to investigators. His wallet remained in the truck. His jewelry was still on his body. Even the truck itself, valued around $40,000, was left untouched. If someone had killed Richard for money, they had failed to take the most obvious valuables. So this led investigators to look back on the park's sinister history. Because at Belton Bridge Park, a random, frightening attack sounded all too plausible. The first major shadow cast over this area dates back to May 10, 1979. 45-year-old Edmund Turner's truck was found 5 feet submerged in the Chattahoochee River, right there at Belton Bridge Park. Edmund's body was in the back of the truck, shot in the head. That same night, police also found the body of 38-year-old Jackie Morris, dead in a car that had been set on fire and burned to a crisp in nearby Hall County. Within days, 28-year-old Keith Fair and 27-year-old Dexter Thomas were charged in both deaths. However, unlike what officers believed about Richard Schoeck's murder, the violence in that case was not random. Alright, so I'm editing this case and I'm realizing that I've actually mispronounced his name the entire way through, so I do apologize for that. However, when I look at the way that people say it, like news outlets, they say Schoeck. Some people will say Schoeck like I did, but then I plug it into Google and Google tells me it's pronounced Schoeck or Schoeck if you're going to use it with the actual German dialect from which it comes from. So, my apologies. It grew out of drinking rage and a group of men who made reckless decisions until there was no turning back. The night began with Dexter, Keith, and Jackie drinking and playing pool at Dexter's house on May 8, 1979. Edmund joined them later, already drunk and carrying a gun. Just a wonderful combination of questionable decisions. They were running low on beer, so they drove off to buy more booze. And then, the group decided to burn down the trailer of a man named Morgan Whitlock, who had reportedly gotten Edmund arrested earlier that day. Thought of just deciding to burn down someone's home on a boys' night is just a baffling notion. But in their alcohol-fueled logic, arson seemed like the only solution. Edmund agreed to pay Keith for the job, but then failed to pay him enough. That was all it took for the night to turn deadly. Keith shot Edmund in the head. After Edmund was for sure dead, Dexter and Jackie put his body in Jackie's trunk. Then, back at Dexter's house, Keith told Dexter to follow him in Edmund's truck so they could move the body. They met on a dirt road right outside Belton Bridge Park, where Jackie transferred Edmund's body into his own truck. Keith then pushed the entire vehicle into the lake, but the night was just beginning for them. One body wasn't enough. Keith was worried about the evidence left in Jackie's car and decided they needed to burn it too. Jackie was hesitant about torching his own vehicle, asking if he could at least remove the radio and tires first, intending to tell his insurance company the car had been stolen. Keith agreed, even offering to help remove the tires. As Jackie bent over, Keith shot him in the head 3 times. Dexter was then told to put Jackie's body in the front seat by the seeming ringleader, Keith, and as they moved Jackie's corpse, Dexter pulled out a pocket knife and cut Jackie's throat. This was likely what is referred to as an insurance cut. One last blow to ensure the job was finished. Dexter and Keith then set Jackie's car on fire, with Jackie unresponsive inside it. Keith was acquitted of Edmund's murder, but pled guilty to killing Jackie, receiving a death sentence. Dexter was found guilty of Jackie's murder and sentenced to life. This is only the beginning of Belton Bridge Park's tainted history. 2 years later, on August 10, 1981, 23-year-old Mark DeNoyer picked up 2 hitchhikers in North Carolina while he was driving back home from visiting family back to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He graciously agreed to give 19-year-old William Page and 23-year-old Gregory Goins rides in the direction he was already headed. The trio stopped in South Carolina for gas, beer, and fireworks, already a recipe for disaster. But as they drove, they smoked joints, took pills, and sipped on their beers, which is, by the way, highly frowned upon. Nevertheless, they kept on, and once they reached Georgia, they exited the interstate, hunting for more drugs. When the search came up empty, William and Mark started arguing, irritable from the come-down. Gregory, asleep in the back seat, awoke to the sound of the two fighting as it got more and more heated. The fight continued to escalate, and Mark reached for a pair of scissors he kept near the driver's seat. But William was faster, pulling out a pocket knife and stabbing Mark in the chest, killing him. William then took the wheel, driving for a few miles before he and Gregory dumped Mark's body. 6 weeks later, Mark's badly decomposed body was found wedged between dead trees in the Chattahoochee River, the same stretch of water backing up to Belton Bridge Park, tying yet another violent death to that spot. But William and Gregory didn't get away with it, thankfully. The North Georgia police found a witness who had seen William driving Mark's car, so the two were arrested and charged with murder. William was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Gregory was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years, though now he roams free. In the mid-1980s, another body was found there. This time, it was the badly decomposed body of a woman who was never identified and remains a Jane Doe. Her story is hauntingly sad because there is none. She has no history, no family, no investigation. She was just left there, found decomposed in a place already saturated with tragedies like hers. Her death added another layer to the park's gruesome reputation, and another unanswered question to a location police knew intimately for all the wrong reasons. Then came August 21st, 2004. 20-year-old James Carlton Smith died after being brutally stabbed in the chest at Belton Bridge Park. James had just gone to a football game and afterward met friends at the park to party. Normal teenage behavior. Except a fight broke out between someone at the party and another young man named James Grizzle. When James Smith tried to break up the fight, he was stabbed 3 times. That whole situation is just devastating. He was just a teen and having fun. Maybe with the wrong crowd, but he wasn't part of the violence. He was just trying to end it. And ultimately, he lost his life by just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was rushed to the hospital where he died. The investigation was difficult. No one saw the fight, and of 15 witnesses, only one claimed to have seen Grizzle with a knife. Grizzle was charged with the murder, but was later acquitted. So yes, it's a bit of an understatement to say that Belton Bridge Park had a history of violence. It was secluded, dark, difficult to patrol, tied to the river, and stained by murder. Police knew it as the place people went to party out of sight, and they also knew it to be a place where bodies were found. This is why Richard's murder could initially look random. It happened in a spot where random violence felt sickeningly possible. But that same gruesome history raised a much more important question. Why did Stacy ask her husband to meet her there of all places, after dark on Valentine's Day? Stacy Morgan Schoeck was born on August 19, 1971 in Florida. Her father died when she was very young, a loss that psychologists would later point to as a source of attachment issues and an inability to form proper relationships. I wonder if that will come into play later. Her family moved around often, and Stacy eventually graduated from Shiloh High School in Snellville, Georgia in 1989. She also claimed she had been sexually abused as a child by someone she refused to identify, which will come into play later in this gruesome story. Whether the sexual abuse was true or not, that claim added another layer for a possible explanation for some of the emotional wreckage that followed her throughout adulthood. Blonde and pretty, Stacy met her first husband in high school. They married right after graduation, only for Stacy to file for divorce 2 years later. At 20, she married again and soon became pregnant with her first son, DJ. That marriage quickly soured, and Stacy filed for divorce yet again while DJ was still just a toddler. Barely an adult, she had already been married and divorced twice. A year later, Stacy tried to stabilize her life, enrolling in Jacksonville University in Florida, where she earned degrees in psychology and nursing in 1994. She got a job straight out of college and seemed to find professional direction easily and excelled in that aspect of life, but personally, her struggle continued. In 1997, Stacy married for a third time, a union that lasted a mere 6 weeks. After her third failed marriage, she then made a vow to just date casually and quit eloping. About a year later, in 1998, she gave birth to another son, Keith, which is pure coincidence to Keith Fair, discussed in the 1979 murders of Jackie Morris and Edmund Turner. Around this time, her career exploded upward. She was doing phenomenally professionally. For the first time, Stacy felt truly in charge of her life. To advance further in her career and open more opportunities, she relocated to Atlanta, taking an administrative position at a hospital that offered ample room for growth, all while continuing to casually date. For a while, the chaos seemed contained, but based on what we've learned so far about Stacy, casual isn't really part of her vocabulary. In 2001, Stacy thought she had finally found the one, marrying for the 4th time and having another son, Kevin. The family moved to Snellville outside Atlanta, and Stacy became an office administrator at Georgia's Spine and Neurosurgery Center. Her husband and sons loved Snellville, but Stacy wasn't content. In 2005, she separated from her 4th husband. This relentless pattern of attachment and dissatisfaction was telling. Again and again, she rushed into marriage, and just as quickly grew restless and walked away. Then came along Richard Schoeck. Stacy met Richard at the hospital where she worked, and he was a bit older, a graphic designer by trade. Born on June 25, 1963 in New Jersey, Richard was 44 when he met the 36-year-old Stacy. He had no grandchildren of his own. A graduate of Auburn University with a degree in art, Richard was known as an adventurous, good-natured, creative, and deeply compassionate man. One coworker called him a kind and gentle person who wanted to make everyone laugh, adding that he never met a stranger. Richard was a man of creativity and spontaneity, so naturally he loved hot air balloons, talking to the sky whenever he could, which is such a unique and telling hobby. With the creative, he also had a little bit of a bad boy in him. He rode a motorcycle. He was a Boy Scout leader, loved to cook and play soccer, really just an incredible, well-rounded man. When he met Stacy, he was working as the facilities manager for the Gwinnett County Medical Building. After attending a summer scouting camp together, the two fell in love under the North Georgia stars, slightly clouded by a lush canopy of trees. Unlike Stacy's previous partners, Richard was non-judgmental of her past, immediately loving her children and even going on to legally adopt her 2 youngest boys, Keith and Kevin. He wasn't put off by her extensive marital history. He accepted her past completely. Richard and Stacy married in early 2007, eloping in a spontaneous, adventurous move that was completely characteristic of Richard and his now wife Stacy. Following the marriage, Richard became a stay-at-home dad, while Stacy became the main breadwinner. Stacy also spent a lot of time caring for her elderly grandparents, who lived an hour and a half away and required round-the-clock care. So after work, Stacy would care for them until the night nurse arrived. On paper, it all made sense and worked out. Stacy had the career, Richard had the heart for family life, and the boys finally had some semblance of stability. Though everything wasn't as peachy keen as it seemed. By 2010, Stacy had been carrying on a long-term affair with a man named Juan for years. She lavished Juan with gifts, paid for his truck and his cell phone, and took him on several romantic getaways, likely disguised as work trips. She used her income to buy up rental properties and even allowed Juan and his family to live in one themselves. Juan worked at the spine center with Stacy, having previously worked security at a swanky hotel. Richard seemed to know about the affair, but instead of leaving, he wanted to work through the problems. That entire notion just really shows Richard's heart. He wasn't trying to abandon his family, he was trying to save it. In January 2010, Stacy decided she was done with Richard, just like she had done with her previous husbands, time and time again. But this time, she didn't file for divorce. Instead, she took out a $560,000 life insurance policy on him. And I'm sure you can see where this is heading. A divorce would have been messy, threatening custody, finances, and the facade of the life Stacy had built. Richard had adopted her two youngest children, and he was the stay-at-home parent, while Stacy worked long hours and maintained her affair. If custody went to court, Stacy's position could have been really threatened. If Richard were to, disappear, every one of those problems would just go away. In early January, Stacy was having lunch with a coworker, Leanna, a 30-year-old mother who also worked in administration. The two often shared frustrations like harmless office gossip, but on this day, Stacy upped the ante. Stacy told Leanna she wanted Richard killed. She gave a reason that, if were true, not claiming one way or the other, would be reason enough for most parents. She said she believed Richard was molesting her sons. Leanna suggested her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Reggie, might be willing to do the job for cash on the side, as he did little odd jobs like this sometimes. If that man takes odd jobs as a hitman, you need to drop him like a hot hit after Thanksgiving. But anyway, saying that your boyfriend is a part-time hitman in the break room is simply insane. But that's neither here nor there. And Stacy most certainly wasn't fazed by this admission. She wanted to hire Reggie. Leanna agreed to ask Reggie if he would do it, and said she'd let Stacy know, as if it were about a work deadline or something mundane. Stacy texted her a few days later to follow up, saying it was a go, and then Leanna set up a meeting between Stacy and Reggie. Reginald Coleman, or Reggie, was born on October 19, 1973, and had spent much of his childhood in the foster care system. He worked as a personal trainer, known as Mr. Results, and held fitness boot camp sessions at the clinic, and also claimed to be a semi-professional boxer. He did have a criminal record, though nothing like what was to come. He was convicted in 1992 for possession with intent to distribute a controlled substance, making him a felon. But by 2010, he had the appearance of a man who had cleaned up his act, working in the same hospital as Stacy and Leanna. On January 18, 2010, Stacy met with Reggie and straight up asked him to kill Richard. Now, it seems as though Reggie was a little reluctant at first, which is better than him just jumping at the opportunity to murder somebody, but he was easily swayed when she repeated the molestation accusation. As a former foster kid, Reggie had likely seen, been around, or possibly even experienced such atrocities. He agreed, and they began drafting their plan. Leanna suggested using a secluded area, and Stacy suggested Belton Bridge Park, a location near her grandparents' house, about 30 minutes by car. She thought this would be a good place to murder someone. As we know, she's not the first to have had this thought. The plan was simple. Stacy would lure Richard to the park to exchange Valentine's Day gifts. Reggie would shoot Richard once in the head to ensure a quick death, per Stacy's request. He would then stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. The code to confirm the deed was done would be a text from Leanna to Stacy that said, "Happy Valentine's Day." For payment, Reggie would receive $10,000, and Stacy's grandparents' 2009 Chevy Impala valued at around $15,000. Lenitra's middleman fee would be the deed to the home she was currently renting from Stacy. It seemed like their plan was really coming together, which was unfortunate. Now, as a convicted felon, Reggie couldn't legally buy a gun, so Stacy withdrew $600 from an ATM and gave it to him for the illegal purchase of a firearm, with instructions to dispose of the weapon after the murder. On January 23, 2010, Stacy, Lenitra, and Reggie all drove out to Belton Bridge Park to run through the plan on the exact spot where Richard would later be killed. A rehearsal, if you will, because as we know, Stacy loves the theatrics. Following that dry run, Stacy transferred $8,900 to Lenitra's account for Reggie, and she gave Reggie the bill of sale for the Impala. She promised the remaining $1,100 would later be delivered before the murder, and Lenitra warned Stacy that if she didn't pay up by Valentine's Day, Reggie wouldn't go through with it, a threat Stacy took seriously. Stacy kept her word, transferring the final balance on February 12th. By then, the plot was far beyond talk. Money moved, a car promised, a gun bought, a location scouted, and a code phrase chosen. Richard, oblivious, was going about his life as a loving husband and father, believing he was preparing for a romantic Valentine's meeting and a getaway with his wife. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, Stacy drove to Cleveland, Georgia, to her grandparents' house to care for them until the night nurse arrived. Richard met her there, but Stacy told him to go on ahead to the park. She said she would follow as soon as the nurse showed up. This was a bald-faced lie. She wasn't waiting on the nurse. She was waiting for Lenitra's text, the signal that the hitman she had hired on her doting husband had finished his job. While waiting, Stacy got a call from Lenitra instead. Reggie needed to know the color of Richard's truck. Stacy told her and hung up. About 30 minutes later, the waiting ended when Stacy received the text from Lenitra. "I forgot to tell you, I'm coming in late for work tomorrow. By the way, Happy Valentine's Day." That was the text, the code, the confirmation. Richard was dead. Stacy then called Richard's cell phone, knowing he wouldn't answer. And when he didn't, she left her grandparents' house and drove toward Belton Bridge Park. Around 9 p.m., Stacy found Richard's body. What she saw immediately told her that nothing had gone according to plan. Reggie had not staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. Richard's wallet, jewelry, and truck were all still there. The most horrifying devastation? Reggie had not shot Richard once in the head for a quick death. He had shot him 6 times in various places. Stacy then made the call to 911, the fake hysterical call. Belton Bridge Park was secluded in the most absolute sense of the word, likely more so than what you were picturing. There was no real lighting, no pavement, and no feeling of safety or oversight. At night, it wasn't a public park, it was a forgotten parking lot by the river, a place where the brief slash of headlights vanished instantly into the profound darkness. This was the scene Richard encountered on Valentine's Day, lying dead right by his truck, and the isolated spot Stacy had pitched to him as romantic. What police found there, however, was violently unromantic. Richard had been shot 6 times by a 9mm gun, 3 times in the chest and abdomen, twice in the face, and once in the head. The patterns of the wounds and the sheer volume of blood around the vehicle told a dynamic, desperate story. This was not swift like Stacy had said she wanted. Richard had been fighting, trying to survive after that initial barrage. The blood smeared inside and outside the truck suggested he was attempting a frantic retreat or desperately scrambling back inside his truck for cover, but it was too late. It was immediately apparent that the scene was not a robbery gone wrong, as aforementioned. This was completely detrimental to Stacy's plan. It needed to look random so she didn't look suspicious. Yet Reggie had abandoned every single valuable object a real robber would have taken. The violence was extreme and real, but the staging was utterly unconvincing. Investigators theorized that Richard had exited his truck and walked toward a vehicle he must have recognized. In such a dark, isolated, and eerie location, no one would casually approach a strange car unless something about it signaled safety or familiarity. Police believed that as Richard neared the other car, the driver opened fire. He then attempted a desperate run back to his truck. The closer range shots, fired probably after Richard had already fallen to the ground in agony, were likely meant to ensure his death. The initial puzzle was simple. Why would Richard approach a strange car in a place like this? That question dodged investigators until they processed the scene fully and found 3 distinct sets of tire tracks. One belonged to Richard's truck, one to Stacy's car, and the third belonged to a supposed mystery vehicle. However, the mystery would not be as such for long. That third vehicle was the Chevy Impala that Stacy had promised Reggie as his payment for the murder. Richard didn't approach a stranger's car. He walked toward what he thought was his wife's ill grandparents, or maybe even Stacy, just driving their car. After everything calmed down from the immediate wreckage, Stacy arrived at the police station for questioning. She played the part of cooperation exceedingly well. She explained her peculiar Valentine's plan, meeting Richard at the secluded Belton Bridge Park for a romantic exchange. She claimed she called his phone on her way to let him know she was running late, but when he didn't answer, she drove to the park anyway. When her headlights cut through the darkness, they illuminated Richard's body, leading her to immediately dial 911. On the surface, she was the grieving wife, explaining a tragically misfired, poor choice of words, romantic gesture. But then, Stacy executed a spontaneous, enormous, and deeply suspicious move. As the interview concluded, she volunteered information police hadn't even asked for. She admitted to her years-long affair with Juan. Why would you introduce a long-term lover in the very first interview after your husband's murder? Maybe it was because she knew that they would find out anyway, or perhaps it was a way to shift investigators away from her and toward her jealous side piece. But anyway, police immediately pivoted, launching an investigation into Juan. They checked his home that night, but he was nowhere to be found. The following day, February 15th, they brought him in for questioning. Juan vehemently denied any involvement and even offered to take a polygraph unprompted. Though the results were inconclusive, he maintained his innocence. He told police he was attempting to reconcile with his ex-wife and coldly referred to Stacy as nothing more than a means to an end. I mean, she basically just functioned as a sugar mama for him. It was a far cry from a jealous, desperate romance, giving investigators a clear picture of their transactional relationship. Juan wasn't a lover desperate to remove Richard. He was simply using Stacy. More critically, Juan had a solid alibi. On Valentine's Day night, he was at his ex-wife's house, who lived with her parents, watching a movie rented from Blockbuster. All three family members corroborated his story. Juan was officially cleared, while Stacy's affair provided context for her dissolving marriage. Juan was not the Juan waiting in the dark at Belton Bridge Park with a 9mm gun. The focus of the investigation narrowed to the third set of tire tracks, the potential key to unlocking the entire case. These tracks belonged to Goodyear Integrity Tires, offering a tangible lead. However, the search to match these tires to a specific car provided frustratingly broad, fitted as they were to a wide array of vehicles. What looked like a promising clue quickly stalled at a dead end. But just as the tire evidence seemed exhausted, the investigation caught a break from an unexpected source, an IT technician at Stacy's spine clinic. While clearing junk mail, the technician noticed an anomaly. Stacy's email box was completely empty for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. This was definitely not normal, according to everyone Stacy worked with. The clinic maintained backups of all emails, which the technician turned over to the police. This single observation cracked the case wide open. Investigators now faced the monumental task of sifting through 4,000 emails. Slow, unglamorous work, but somewhere within that digital mountain lay the paper trail Stacy had desperately tried to erase. Deep in the emails, investigators unearthed a request to transfer $8,900 from a real estate account tied to the doctor's office into the personal account of Lenitra Ross. They found a second transfer of $1,100 sent to Lenitra's account on February 12th. The figures were damning. They totaled exactly $10,000, the fee Stacy had agreed to pay Reggie for Richard's murder. Police quickly identified Lenitra as Stacy's employee and tenant, renting a house from her. They showed up at her home. When questioned about the $8,900, Lenitra offered a plausible cover story, claiming the money was for home repairs she performed under an informal arrangement with her landlord, Stacy. While such exchanges do occur between tenants and landlords, the explanation collapsed under the weight of context. The timing of Richard's death, the exact total of $10,000, the connection to Stacy, and the separate $1,100 payment. Lenitra was now inextricably tied to Stacy by a growing web of money, property, and communication. Not to mention, it seems as though the money Stacy paid them with wasn't even hers to spend. The conspiracy gained another crucial layer when police spoke to Stacy's cousin, Connie, who asked about her grandparents' missing Impala. Stacy's grandparents had instructed her to sell the car to cover their medical bills, and Stacy claimed she sold it for $14,000. Connie, however, discovered Stacy had never transferred the proceeds to her grandparents. This wasn't merely financial fraud. It was a beacon pointing directly back to the crime scene. Police located the Impala at Lenitra's house. The vehicle was equipped with Goodyear Integrity tires, a perfect match for the elusive third set tire tracks at Belton Bridge Park. The disparate pieces were rapidly locking into place. The $10,000 payment to Lenitra, the missing Impala now sitting in Lenitra's home, the tires matching the crime scene tracks, and the strong inference that Richard had approached a familiar vehicle. Investigators could now clearly visualize the shape of the conspiracy, but they needed hard, undeniable proof to secure arrests and ensure the case would stand a chance in court. Retracing the scene in their minds, police considered the waiting killer. What does a lone figure do in the dark? They communicate, call, text, whatever it may be. They are active on their phone. They text the person coordinating the plot. With Stacy's phone records, police confirmed a flurry of texts between Stacy and Lenitra on Valentine's evening, and earlier communications detailing the money transfers. Next, they secured tower dump records from the cell phone towers near Belton Bridge Park. These records placed a pivotal phone conversation between Lenitra and Reggie at approximately 8:40 p.m. on Valentine's Day. This timing was critical. It was exactly when police estimated Richard was being murdered, fitting seamlessly between Stacy's staged call to Richard and her 911 call around 9 p.m. The phone data established communication between the conspirators right inside the narrow window of Richard's final moments. Lenitra and Reggie's phone records cemented this timeline, showing weeks of calls and texts between all three conspirators. The plot was now evident across multiple interlocking pieces of evidence. Police knew about the money transfers, Reggie's use of the Impala, the house gifted to Lenitra, and the matching tires at the crime scene. The final damning piece arrived when they discovered the massive $506,000 life insurance policy Stacy had taken out on Richard just weeks before. That's usually not a coincidence, and most certainly wasn't in this case. This was a visible, undeniable, coordinated murder for hire plot. Meanwhile, Richard's funeral took place on February 20th. In a touching tribute to his artistic nature, attendees were asked to wear their favorite color, a small act of kindness that perfectly suited the man remembered as creative, warm, and full of life and fun. His service was a burst of color rather than a simple drape of black. Yet amid the grief, Richard's family noticed Stacy's performance, remembering her weeping dramatically and overplaying the role of the devastated wife in front of people who were already deeply suspicious. Stacy's final gesture, arranging to spread Richard's ashes from a hot air balloon, a hobby he adored, felt like a grasp at straws for his family. They had suspected her from the beginning and were growing furious that the police had not yet acted. From an external perspective, the investigation appeared sluggish. In reality, police were orchestrating a massive multi-county operation they codenamed Tangled Web, because that's what it really was. The sheer scale required 7 search warrants across 4 different counties and 3 simultaneous arrests. The paramount challenge was perfect synchronization. An early arrest of one perp would risk tipping off the others, allowing them to flee, destroy evidence, or align their stories. Police had to move with absolute precision, all at once. Reggie was the first conspirator apprehended. Lenitra was nabbed during a traffic stop. The final move was a calculated swoop on Stacy at the very location that had served as her evil lab, her office. Stacy, however, had been tipped off. Though she couldn't escape, she barricaded herself inside a keycard access room. It was a telling moment of her desperation. The walls of the office where she had orchestrated the entire plot were now closing in, and she eventually surrendered without a fight. All 3, Reggie, Lenitra, and Stacy, were taken into custody and interviewed separately. Lenitra maintained her flimsy claim of being an innocent bystander, oblivious to the plot. Reggie flat out denied everything. That left Stacy. She was the final piece investigators needed to break the case wide open. Police laid out what they knew. Lenitra and Reggie had agreed to help her, but the crucial, lingering question remained. Why did Stacy want Richard dead? It had been the central mystery from the start. Why bypass divorce? Why not just leave and instead implicate a coworker and her boyfriend? Facing the overwhelming evidence, Stacy finally admitted every detail of her plan. Her justification was devastating. She claimed Richard was molesting her children, alleging one of her sons had confessed this to her. Citing her own history of childhood sexual abuse, Stacy claimed she felt driven to protect her boys. She didn't want to involve the police or file for divorce. She simply wanted Richard removed permanently. She insisted she told this to Lenitra, who then connected her with Reggie. On June 10, 2010, Stacy, Lenitra, and Reggie were all indicted for malice murder. Stacy and Reggie were both facing the death penalty, but prosecutors offered Stacy a deal. They would take the death penalty off the table if she testified against her co-conspirators. Lenitra was also offered a plea deal, a 20-year sentence, if she agreed to testify. Lenitra refused, though. She refused because she didn't want to be the person responsible for putting the father of her child on death row, which is an excruciating decision to make, but one that, in a case of nothing logical, actually makes sense. Lenitra's trial commenced on May 15, 2012 in Hall County. The prosecution argued she was far more than a passive observer accidentally swept up in Stacy's destructive wake. She was the pivotal go-between, having helped, advised, encouraged, hired, counseled, and procured Richard's murder. She had engineered the connection, facilitated the payment, participated in the crucial communication that led Richard to Belton Bridge Park. Seems like she had the perfect experience for administration. Lenitra's defense countered, arguing the evidence failed to prove she knew it was a murder-for-hire plot, insisting she believed Reggie was merely being hired for a carjacking. They launched an aggressive assault on Stacy's credibility, labeling her as the most despicable person in this entire case. They're not wrong. Urging the jury to disregard her testimony. This was the defense's core strategy. Stacy was a proven liar with every motive to minimize her own role and deflect blame after securing a deal to avoid the death penalty. Testifying in exchange for her life, Stacy confirmed she asked Lenitra to hire Reggie to kill Richard, reiterating the molestation accusation and her own childhood trauma as her motive. But a staggering moment of clarity arrived when she admitted that after police interviewed her sons and they denied Richard had abused them, she claimed she realized she had been wrong. This shocking retraction retroactively stripped the murder plot of its self-proclaimed emotional engine. Stacy had used the accusation to justify the killing and to sway Reggie, only for the children to deny it once Richard was dead. On May 22nd, the jury found Lenitra Ross guilty. She was sentenced to life without parole. She again refused the chance to testify against Reggie for a lighter sentence. She later explained the agonizing choice. The deal was not simply to take 20 years. The deal was also, you have to send your baby's father to death. For Lenitra, accepting responsibility was one thing, but betraying the father of her child in a death penalty case was impossible. Though her conviction stood, her appeal to the Supreme Court of Georgia was denied on February 2, 2015. Reggie Coleman's trial was scheduled. His defense intended to rely heavily on his history as a foster child and his alleged manipulation by Stacy's molestation claims, positioning himself as a protector of children rather than a cold-blooded killer. However, on the first day of court in November 2012, Reggie abruptly abandoned his plan and pled guilty. At sentencing, his troubled foster care history and Stacy's accusations were discussed, but ultimately, Reggie was sentenced to life without parole, plus an additional 5 years for firearm charges. In December 2012, Stacy Schoeck also pled guilty. After her sentencing, a cascade of victim impact statements painted the true portrait of Richard, a beloved uncle, stepfather, and friend. He was remembered as a non-violent, caring artist who embraced everyone he met. This was the man Stacy murdered, a man completely opposed to the monster she invented to justify her actions. When Stacy took the stand to beg for leniency, she offered an astonishing statement. I said, I'm going to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and that's what I did. And that's disgustingly awful. She then followed this with a chilling irony, saying, someone told me the definition of mercy is getting what you don't deserve. It was an extraordinary request coming from the woman who had unilaterally decided Richard deserved no mercy at all. She had eschewed all legal and protective recourse, no police report, no divorce filing, choosing instead to appoint herself the ultimate authority over Richard's life. Now, she sought compassion from the court she had circumvented. The emotional weight of the case was underscored when her mother, Rena Morgan, read testimony from Richard's adopted son, Kevin. The 10-year-old's words revealed the full wreckage. I miss her every hour of every day, just like Daddy Richard. Kevin had lost his adopted father to murder and his mother to the justice system. Stacy testified that her motive remained the same, her genuine belief that Richard was molesting her oldest son, Keith, a belief Keith continued to vehemently deny. Stacy's defense presented a list of mitigating factors, including the early loss of her father and her own alleged childhood sexual abuse. However, a full psychological assessment conducted to ensure her fitness for trial revealed a crucial distinction. While she may have carried genuine childhood trauma, the doctors concluded she was not distraught at the time of the murder. Her defense depended on the notion that fear and trauma had shattered her judgment, yet the assessment refuted this, describing not a woman in emotional collapse, but one fully capable of calculated, cold planning. Richard's sister Carol Fillingham offered the most brutal assessment to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She was such a cowardly woman that couldn't keep herself in control and had never had anyone that stood up to her. When you get too much power and control, you just believe you can do anything. Richard's family saw her not as a traumatized protective mother, but as a woman addicted to control, so entitled she felt she possessed the right to decide Richard's fate. On December 5, 2012, Stacy Schoeck was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The entire meticulously planned conspiracy had utterly unraveled. The secluded park, the missing Impala, the tire tracks, the deleted emails, the money transfers, the phone records, the tower dump, the coded Valentine's message, and the $560,000 life insurance policy all formed an undeniable chain leading directly back to her. What had initially appeared as another tragic random killing at Belton Bridge Park was revealed to be a far more cold and calculated assassination. Richard had not tragically stumbled into violence. He had been deliberately directed to his death by the person he trusted most. In the end, Richard Schoeck wasn't just another victim of Belton Bridge Park's dark history. He was a man whose light and laughter were extinguished by a betrayal from the person he chose to love unconditionally. His story serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't always lurking in the shadows of a secluded park, but can sometimes be found sharing our own homes. Because while Stacy sought the ultimate control over Richard's fate, she only succeeded in cementing his memory as a kind soul lost to a senseless, greedy web of her own making. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.